the government is going to have to make a decision whether or not it's prepared to come in and bail them out. If they are prepared to come in and bail them out and decide that they're going to let them fail, that's going to mean a lot of staff without jobs. It's going to mean students in limbo who are in the middle of their degrees, and landlords who rent to students, pubs, and all sorts of businesses that are affected by the university are going to be hit pretty hard.
Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Ben Zaranko, filling in this week for Paul while he's off enjoying his holidays. As the summer draws to a close and we gear up for an eventful autumn, we're bringing you a series of briefings looking at different areas of government policy, the challenges they face, and the choices that are facing the new Labour government. Last week we talked about the NHS. Also last week, hundreds of thousands of students received their A-level results. Hundreds of thousands more received their results for BTECs, T-levels and other qualifications. So a big day for the students, big day for the teachers, big day for the parents, and a big day for anyone who works in a pub with a younger clientele. So today, we're going to be zooming in on some of those areas. We're going to be thinking about what the students might go on to do next, and what some of the big policy questions are in higher and further education. To do this, I'm delighted to be joined by my IFS colleagues Jack Britton and Christine Farquharson. Jack, Christine, let's start by taking this from the perspective of the new government. So Jackie Smith is the new Minister for Skills. She's back in government after a previous stint under Gordon Brown. She's the one with responsibility for a lot of this stuff. What do you think should be top of her in tray? Jack, start with you.
Hi, Ben. I think it's impossible to answer that question without going straight to the big issue of the day, which is university finances. I think that's going to be right at the top of the in tray for her. Okay,
we've got university finances. Christine?
I mean, I think university finances are probably going to end up being at the top of the in tray because they are a big deal. There are a lot of pressures there, and they're also really highly politically salient. A lot of people care about them. But if we're talking about what will make the most impact or what might have the biggest long-term potential, then I think that there are other questions around the skills system and whether that's delivering what we need for economic growth as well as what we need for equity.
Okay, so that sounds like more of a longer-term focus, which we'll park for now and come back to. Let's talk about this what sounds like the short-term pressing thing, which is universities and what trouble they might be in. I mean, if you read the papers, it sounds like there's a lot of very worried university leaders out there. There sounds like there's some bankruptcies on the horizon, maybe some redundancies. Jack, how bad is it? How much pressure are universities feeling at the moment?
Yeah, I do think it's pretty bad, actually. The data are sort of annoyingly slow to come through on this. But the picture in 22-23 was of a sector with a small overall surplus, but around 1 in 5 institutions running deficits, in some cases pretty large deficits, and institutions that are in quite serious trouble. We don't know exactly where we are for 24-25, largely because we don't know yet how many international students are going to turn up. And they're quite pivotal for university finances, especially these days. But it does seem highly likely that the sector is going to be running a deficit overall, and it could be as many as half of institutions running individual deficits. And I think a handful of institutions right on the edge of insolvency. So I think it's bad.
So for someone who doesn't think about this stuff as much, how big a deal is it for a university to be running a deficit? Is that just par for the course for some of these places, or is itself a sign of things, of trouble to come?
It does happen quite a lot. So universities dip in and out of deficits. I think the big concern is that universities need to borrow to cover their costs when they're not bringing in as much income as they need to cover the costs. And sometimes it becomes the case that nobody out there is willing to lend them any money. So they have agreements with lenders that they're not going to run deficits above certain amounts, for example. And once they start to break those covenants, they can end up struggling to find anyone to lend them money, and then they literally become insolvent and ultimately could end up failing. So it can be, it is something that happens, but I think we're at a point where there are universities genuinely at a point where they might go over that threshold.
Right, so we could be at a tipping point. Now, can you talk me through how we've managed to get to this point? If, universities, I think I'm right in saying tuition fees in in England are quite a bit higher than in lots of other countries. If you hear about people going and doing very cheap degrees on the continent, for example, clearly we don't have tuition fees at other stages of the education system. How have we got here to this point where we're at this tipping point you're talking about?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, university funding went up a lot in 2012 with the increase in tuition fees from what was at the time just over £3,000 to £9,000. And they had a lot of cash then. And this meant that university students received the most funding throughout the education system per student per year, up to 50% more than earlier stages in the education system, which is pretty substantial. I think ultimately that, plus the fact that universities are able to attract international students who pay sometimes very, very large fees, should mean that the sector is in reasonable health at this point. But I think the problem is that universities expected funding to go up after the 2012 reforms, and it didn't. Fees have been frozen at pretty much the same level since then, with one rise to 9,250, but they've been stuck at that level for quite a long time now. We're actually in a very similar situation now to where we were about 5 years ago. The system was also teetering a bit. But at that point, Boris Johnson, who was Prime Minister at the time, relaxed student visa rules to allow more international students to make the country more attractive for international students. And that ultimately kind of kicked the can down the road a little bit, and universities expanded a lot in terms of their international student places. But I think it's fair to say with recent tightening of the rules, we've kind of ridden that wave, and we're now kind of back in a situation of universities being short of cash.
Right. So if I've heard you right, I started university in 2013. So it sounds like I timed that almost perfectly to maximize the real terms value of my student debt. Is that right?
That is about right. Well done. Yeah.
Yeah. The cursed generation. So, Christine, am I right in thinking that it's not just some of these universities that are struggling? We're seeing other types of, further education institutions also up against it.
Well, I think this comes back to what Jack just said. He sort of slipped it in there that actually after that first tuition fee rise was implemented for universities, you ended up with around 50% more resources per student per year than many other stages of education. It's huge. So to put kind of concrete numbers on that, in 2012, after this tuition fee rise was implemented, universities were getting just shy of £12,000 per student per year. FE colleges were getting more like £8,000 per student per year. So that is a huge discrepancy. And actually, what we've seen then is that universities have been eroded basically back to where they were before the tuition fee rise was implemented. FE colleges have actually fallen backwards even from where they were at that point. So not only did FE not have the kind of good times, they've been pushed back and squeezed even harder than universities since then. And so the sector there is, seeing a lot fewer learners, just a much smaller total number of learners. Part of that's a kind of policy decision to crack down on courses that were felt to have lower value. And on top of that, they're seeing fewer resources per learner than other comparable sectors, or indeed than over time. So you add that together and you get quite a substantial squeeze on total college income. And what we've seen in the colleges sector is that, a university is at risk of going bust. That's headline news. In the colleges sector, a lot of this has been kind of managed offline, collaborative process with DFE and the colleges kind of working together, and a lot of, sort of forced mergers and forced plans to try and get those colleges back to financial health or get them absorbed into another institution that would be healthier. But, in some ways, whatever the university sector is facing now, whatever they're dealing with now, colleges have been there first, but harder.
That sounds about right. I mean, just to think about the comparative teaching resources there, how much of this is a story of universities having some very expensive courses to provide? If you think about, you need to have cadavers for medicine students or something. Would you expect, colleges just to have sort of lower cost base?
I'm not totally convinced on that logic. So I think a lot of the education that colleges provide, some of it is sort of resets of English and math, and you sit in a classroom and you can argue about how expensive or how cheap that is. But a lot of what they do is kind of meant to be vocationally oriented and
more hands-on.
More hands-on. And you think about, a workshop where you need to have the saw and the lathe and all of the other bits and pieces to be able to make that valuable. I'd almost flip that question on its head. And I'd say, well, given that college teachers, I think I'm right in saying, are this year going to be earning less even than school teachers, a newly qualified college teacher. And given that a lot of these cost pressures are really, not so very different from universities, why is it that universities are so expensive? I don't know if Chak has any insight for us on that.
Unfortunately, not really. I think Philip Auger, who did a review of the higher education and post-18 education system that was published in 2019, he tried to dig into the costs of university degrees quite a lot in that, and ultimately, I think, concluded that it was quite difficult to get a coherent story out of why exactly it does cost quite so much money. I would say a lot of money is allocated to access and participation. That was part of the 2012 reforms, that university needed to spend a certain share of their income on access. So I think that's an area that does get quite a lot of spending, but things like advertising are also maybe more costly in the higher education space. But I think it remains a bit of an open question, to be honest.
Interesting. So I want to go back to that access question later, but let's stick on this financing question for now. If we're at a point where there's a couple of universities teetering on the edge, what happens if a university does go bust? What happens next?
Well, I think the government is going to have to make a decision whether or not it's prepared to come in and bail them out, basically. If they are prepared to come in and bail them out and decide that they're going to let them fail, that's going to mean a lot of staff without jobs. It's going to mean students in limbo who are in the middle of their degrees who suddenly maybe drop out of their degree or have to find another course quickly. And landlords who rent to students, pubs, and all sorts of businesses that are affected by the university are going to be pretty hit pretty hard. So I think ultimately it's unlikely that the government would let a university fail, and I think it would come in and offer a bailout fund with some pretty strict conditions, and possibly forcing mergers between institutions that are failing and maybe institutions that are doing a bit better. But it's a tricky thing to have to deal with.
I can totally see the transitional issues about students mid-degree, or what do you do about people who've got employment contracts and all those sorts of things. But if you could just imagine we could chuck enough money at the university so that all existing students get through their courses and so on. Does this relate to the question of, do we think that the current number of universities is the perfect one? If we think that no university should be allowed to fail, isn't that implicitly saying we've got the right number of universities now? Or am I thinking about it the wrong way?
So I think this comes back to something we see a lot in education policy, actually, other than in schools. In education, we have a lot of public funding for services that are being delivered by essentially private providers. And so there's this tension between saying we want to have private provision because we want to have incentive for these providers to compete on cost, on quality, keep costs low, keep quality high. And we think that that's the sort of most effective way of delivering this. Versus on the other side of that, well, you're not really quite in a market if you're saying any of the benefits you keep yourself, any of the risks government is going to come in and insure you against them. And so I think there's a question here for the government about how hardline they want to be on this. Is it that they really want to send a message to the sector that, these are private institutions, there's opportunity there for them to make profits and manage their own finances and that they're responsible for doing that? Or are they trying to send a message that says, well, don't worry too much about that because we'll underwrite you? And I think what we've seen in the FE sector is they've kind of tried to do a halfway house between that. So they've come in and they've said, well, we're not going to totally let you go bust, but we're going to matchmake and try and organize this merger process so that you just keep ticking over. Fundamentally, though, as soon as you send a message to a sector that says government's got your back, you're really changing the incentives and you're really changing the sense of responsibility that there is in that sector to keep their own house in order.
I can also imagine the merger question feels hard when some of these universities are, some of the ones you might think worry most about failing are ones where they're a really important local employer and they play a really important role to the local economy, where there isn't another university you can merge with. Let's imagine the government sides. It doesn't want the sector to be under so much financial pressure. It wants to try and reduce that. What are some of the routes they might take? Can you talk me through the choices there, Jack, if you were advising Jackie Smith?
Yeah, I think the first and most obvious answer that vice chancellors are clamouring for at the moment is for a clear path for tuition fee rises over the next few years. So, as I said, tuition fees have been frozen in cash terms since 2012, pretty much, with one rise since then. And they would be looking for sort of inflation-linked tuition fee rises over the next few years. So that in itself won't kind of bail out the institutions that really are teetering on the edge here, because it just won't be significant enough. But I think it will create certainty in the sector, in universities that are sort of closer to running kind of manageable deficits or running small surpluses. And I think ultimately that would be very important in the sector for kind of stopping very harsh cost-cutting measures that are being put in place just to try and stop universities running into deficits that are going to be problematic for them, which may not necessarily be in the kind of overall interest or long-run interest of the institution or the country. So, for example, universities are running big voluntary severance schemes now. Those schemes may not get rid of the most productive workers in the universities and may not be the most cost-effective way to manage a workforce, but it's kind of a measure that's in place just to try and kind of put out fires in the short term. And I think providing some financial certainty over the landscape over the next few years would help to get universities to be thinking slightly longer term about dealing with those measures.
Just let's say Jackie Smith says, well, the problem is with that, Jack, is that Keir Starmer ran for the Labour leadership on a policy of getting rid of tuition fees entirely, and for him to now turn around and increase them very early on, that's off the table. So what else can I do? Another
approach that they could take would be to increase teaching grants. So rather than increasing tuition fees that the students are nominally on the hook for, they could just increase direct teaching grants, which the government pay to universities directly. These grants were a big part of the system before 2012, and they're much less important now, although they do still exist for some of the higher cost subjects. It could decide that it wants to increase these grants. An advantage of that is that the government can be more selective about where it spends that money. So it could decide that there are certain priority subject areas that it wants to fund more than others. And it could quite easily do that through sort of higher teaching grants for high priority subjects. The disadvantage is in terms of costs and the fiscal targets of this Labour government. The costs are much higher if you choose to use teaching grants. If you increase them funding by teaching grants the same amount as you increase tuition fees, because students will pay back most of those extra tuition fees while the government's on the hook for the grant funding. Also, losses on student loans or spending on student loans that are not repaid count differently in the government accounts than teaching grants. So the use of teaching grants would be more damaging for the Labour government in terms of hitting its short-run fiscal targets.
I think the important thing to emphasize as well is, tuition fees now matter for young people in a way that previously they didn't matter quite as much, because there have been a lot of changes to the rules around how long people have to repay. So that's been extended from 30 years to 40. There are changes to sort of how much you're repaying at what threshold and all of that kind of stuff. But the upshot there is largely students now are repaying a much higher fraction of their tuition fee, of their sort of notional student debt, than they would have been before. And so you might have previously looked at that and said, well, we'll put up tuition fees, but actually that's not going to come from the students. That's going to end up coming from a taxpayer write-off. And so teaching grants, taxpayer write-off, in the long run, it's much of a muchness. Because of those changes, we're now in a world where those two different policy levers actually are starting to look a lot more distinct.
Right, because now we're expecting each cohort of university students to pay back something like 2/3 of the loan. Is that right? Whereas previously it was less than half. And the precise numbers here maybe don't matter as much as the sense of direction, but I take the point. Whereas the grant funding scores immediately up front, and it counts as resource, day-to-day spending, whereas the write-offs on student loans are weirdly enough classed as investment spending. And so for a government with a promise to borrow only to invest, that could affect the decision-making, even though, as ever, the accounting treatment probably ought not to be governing policy on something this important. The other area, you hinted at it earlier on, Jack, where universities get a lot of money is international students. And the last government tightened up some of the visa controls for international students, a deliberate policy effort in particular to reduce how many students are bringing dependents to the UK. Do you think if the government were to simply relax visa rules, would that be enough to buy them some time?
They could do that. And I think it would make quite a difference to university finances in the short run. Bridget Phillipson explicitly ruled it out, though, so I just don't think it's very realistic.
Okay, we're running out of options here, so we are left with the choice of what the status quo is, to just universities have to cost cut, try and live within their means. We sort of muddle through. Is that seeming like one of the most likely outcomes here?
I think more likely the government will decide to create some sort of short-term solution, like not necessarily a long-term plan for increasing teaching grants, but a sort of short-term teaching grant-based solution. So a fund that is made available ultimately to stop universities going under, but without being quite so explicit as making that the policy, to try to avoid the dangers that Christine outlined before. And I think more likely they'll do that, and they'll combine that with some sort of review of the system for us to kick the can down the road a little bit further.
If in doubt, announce a big long-term review. They'll definitely this time find the answer. I think that I can totally see the case for that. But let's imagine that you're right, Jack, and that the new government gets a grip on this short-term problem, finds a route through the immediate challenges facing university finances, put out some fires, and then they start to look towards the longer term and the bigger priorities, the things for which they'd like to be remembered on their Wikipedia pages. So we know that one of Labour's 5 missions is, I'm now quoting, break down barriers to opportunity by reforming our childcare and education systems to make sure there is no class ceiling on the ambitions of young people in Britain. It seems to me that post-18 education might form part of that. So before we think about what those policy levers might look like, Christine, could you set the scene a little bit in terms of, I suppose, what are the pathways people take through the education system, and what sort of areas should we be thinking about when it comes to breaking down barriers to opportunity?
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is let's think about post-16 instead of post-18, because actually England is quite unusual internationally in that 16 to 18 bracket really is a place where young people start to make meaningful choices that are going to affect their long-term future. So, the big picture here is that if you look at 16-year-olds who get their GCSE results, so the young people we're going to see later this week getting their results, around half of them meet the benchmark for good GCSEs, and that benchmark's changed a little bit over time, and the fraction has changed a bit over time, but it's around half, which is actually surprisingly small, because then you have all of this that we've been talking about with universities and the sort of academic path. That's really only relevant. That's really only the path for around half of young people.
So what's good here? What's good GCSEs?
So at the moment, that is getting a grade 5 in English and math.
Oh, I forgot we changed the numbers now.
Yeah, we changed the numbers.
I'm still thinking letters. Okay.
Sorry. So it used to be five GCSEs, A star to C.
That sounds more familiar.
There's another sort of supplementary benchmark that has English and math included. So the benchmarks do change over time, and the grading system changes over time. But
I feel so old now, not even being familiar with the grading system we use in school.
Yeah, well, you're clearly not frequenting enough pubs with young clientele, as you wanted us to believe at the start of this. Anyway, so the young people who don't get that GCSE benchmark the first time around, by the time they then have a few years, and many of them choose to resit. So by the time you get to age 19, around a third of young people have A levels. Another quarter or so have vocational level 3 qualifications, so sort of vocational equivalent. Around 10% of those who didn't get good GCSEs the first time around have upgraded. So that's good. They've resat and they've managed to meet that benchmark. But still, around 20% of them don't even have that GCSE benchmark by 19. And if you fast forward even more to age 26, you now have around a third of young people with degrees, a third of them with A levels or vocational qualifications, 20% of them with GCSEs, and then actually 15% of them, so about 1 in 6, still without GCSE level qualifications. And I think that those last two groups really often get kind of dropped or forgotten in the debate of what is out there for them and what is the route through for them.
I suppose I don't have a great sense of how big a deal is it if you don't have your GCSE in maths or English, so you don't meet this benchmark, but you're very successfully working in a garage.
Yeah.
You know?
So there's a lot of really good research actually that says that meeting that benchmark at age 16 is really transformational for young people's futures. Now, all of this is talking about averages. So absolutely, you're going to be able to find as many case studies as you want out there, because England's a big place, of people who don't meet the GCSE benchmark and go on to have amazingly successful careers and wonderful earnings, and probably better than some people who go to university. That's true. But on average, missing out on that GCSE benchmark, even by like the tiniest of margins, so you're basically just as clever and just as skilled as somebody who just made the grade and you've just missed out, that has a really big impact on, one, your likelihood of staying in education, so your ability to access things like A-levels or university if you want to, and then kind of partly through that, two, on your long-term earnings, and even on factors like health or some of the wider outcomes that we might think about. So these things are all really super interrelated. They're, income drives health, and there's a lot going on there. But actually, the way that the English system is set up, that benchmark at age 16 really does matter on average for young people's futures.
And we devote a lot of time thinking about I've already forgotten all your numbers, about the 1/3 who go to university. Was that right?
Yeah, it's by 26, about a third have a degree.
Okay, I suspect that well more than 1/3 of the discussion, I mean, as partly as we're proving, but 1/3 of the media coverage and so on, and one suspects the policy attention probably goes to that 1/3 as well.
Yeah, huge amounts. It's hugely disproportionate, and a third have a degree, a third have GCSEs or nothing. And which one of those do we focus on most?
Yeah, I mean, that's huge. So I guess FE we've talked about, and then there's this whole other section of people who are not doing further education, not gaining further qualifications. That number, I mean, they're often referred to as NEETs, are they not in employment, education or training? That number started to inch up recently.
Yeah, it has. So it's inching up to about 15% of 18 to 24-year-olds in the most recent data. And that's really concerning, to be honest. Because
I presume that breaks a long-term trend.
It had been coming down. So that's partly a kind of policy thing. England has raised the school leaving age a couple of times. So they've, in theory now, if you're 18 or younger, you have to be in some form of education or training or work. So that there's been some sort of policy changes around that. But this group who are starting out their sort of careers, starting out their lives, making that transition out of education into the labour market and basically falling through the cracks, it's really hard to think about how you re-engage them. One thing that we know is that in this case, as in many others, prevention's a lot better than cure. It's really hard to take somebody who's been long-term out of the labour market and re-engage them and get them back in to do kind of meaningful work. And so for that young person who's really at the start of their life, that suggests that they're going to have 30, 40, 50 years ahead of them of really struggling to be able to access good earnings, access good jobs, access work. And that has huge impacts, not just on their own kind of personal financial well-being, has impacts on health, it has impacts on mental health, has impacts on all kinds of other things. Sometimes the causality goes the other way, of course. But this is really an issue. So one of the most shocking stats that our colleagues have pulled out is if you look at 30-year-olds and you look at 30-year-olds who have a degree, about 8% of them have a disability. If you look at 30-year-olds who have no qualifications, it's a quarter of them have a disability. To get to a quarter of graduates who have a disability, you have to go all the way out to age 60. So this is really not just about, they're going to be on benefits and that's going to cost the government money. This is about, across all of these dimensions of their life, this is a really significant step and a really significant predictor that there are going to be a lot of things that just get in the way of that young person having good life chances.
Yeah, I remember exactly that study and exactly that chart, and it is completely and utterly alarming. So I guess the big picture question here then is, if you were thinking about opportunity and you're thinking about what are the barriers to people, what's the phrase that politicians like to use, getting on in life, it's not immediately obvious then that university clearly can't be the answer for everyone. But if you were, we've got £1 to spend, it's not even obvious that university would be where you look. But let's think about universities then and about opportunity, Jack. And what do we know about universities and social mobility? What do we know about the role of universities in driving that?
Typically, we think about mobility in terms of access and returns separately. So access to higher education and then returns from higher education. And we think about whether there are differences in access and differences in returns between those coming from richer and poorer backgrounds. And there would be a concern, clearly, if there were very large differences in the chances of getting to university and very large differences in the outcomes from university. So if it was just the rich who were benefiting from going to university. But that actually isn't really the case, I think. So while there are large gaps in access to university, once you adjust for differences in prior attainment, those typically go away. So it's not the case that there are lots of people who are sufficiently qualified to go to university who are then choosing not to go. It's more that there aren't enough people coming from poorer backgrounds who are sufficiently qualified to go to university. So once you adjust for prior attainment, you tend to see not very large gaps in access. Then separately, we look at returns and we look at whether there's variation in returns by parental background. And again, typically, we actually don't see very large differences. We see that the poorest students tend to benefit, on average, similar amounts to those who come from the richest backgrounds. So I think while there are some important subplots within that, broadly speaking, the higher education does okay with what it's got. In terms of mobility, I don't think it exacerbates inequality. Rather, I think the problems are more upstream. There are just very, very large differences in attainment by parental background that arise earlier in the system.
So in other words, if you're waiting until 18 and the university system to try and undo some of these socioeconomic inequalities, you're leaving it too late, basically. We should be thinking about schools and early years and family backgrounds and things we can do to promote people's development earlier in life. If you wait until 18, there's only so much universities can do. Is that sort of the reading of it that I'm getting from you?
I think that's right. I mean, it's not that they're not important. Of course, there are many things that can make a difference. So it's not something that should be totally ignored. But it's just if you're picking, where's the highest bang for your buck here in terms of narrowing gaps, I think it probably wouldn't be in the university system.
Okay, but if we're thinking, let's say we're still focusing here on post-16, where else, if you are, Jackie Smith, there's only so many hours in the day, you can't do everything. If we're thinking university maybe isn't top priority, what else could be, Christine?
So I think if you're Jackie Smith, quite narrowly, then there's two groups that you can make a strong case to think about. One is that 20% of people aged 26 or so who have GCSEs and nothing more. You could think about what can you do to help them access in-work training, for example, which we know is disproportionately those who are given more. Those with higher levels of education are much more likely to get training on the job. So option one is you really think about people who are kind of meeting good qualifications, but could do with a little bit of a boost to continue that and to access higher paying jobs than they otherwise would. Option number two is you look at that 1 in 6 26-year-olds who don't even have good GCSEs. And that's going to be probably in terms of economic growth or in terms of the public finances. If you're able to do something to support that group into meaningful opportunities, like we've talked about, that's got decades to pay off. So that is probably going to be a really strong benefit to even just very narrowly to the public purse. The reason I don't say that that's 100% what you have to do is because I think that's also going to be a group that is harder to help and where you need to think a lot more carefully about not just we're going to put in this one policy and that's going to fix it, but really you're going to be picking up people with severe health problems. You're going to be picking up people with severe mental illness. You're going to be picking up people who maybe have never had the ability to engage with the school system. And so probably what that means is you're going to need more intensive services and you're going to need different packages of support to deal with different kinds of problems. So I think that group is a harder nut to crack. But even if you started to just wedge the nut open a little bit at the side, that would be something that could be really transformational, both for young people themselves, but also more broadly for the public finances.
Right. So you mentioned there benefits for growth, which is another of Labour's missions, but let's just put that to one side for a second and let's stick on this. So if we're thinking about the opportunities available for these people, this sort of group, things like apprenticeships feel relevant, things like vocational and technical qualifications feel relevant. But when we think about those areas, to what extent is it a cash problem? We know that those sectors have been underfunded in the past relative to other bits of the education system. We were talking about that earlier on. Or to what extent is part of this, we talk about FE not getting enough attention, but one problem is that we can't stop chopping and changing. There's a new type of level, new replace whatever the qualifications were before every other week. And maybe it's too much attention, too much regular policy churn. I mean, is it both of those things? Would the best thing we could do just chuck some money and promise not to reform anything?
I think there's definitely an argument for chucking a little bit of money, and I think there's probably quite an argument as well for let some of the reforms bed in. I mean, we talked a couple of weeks ago about the slightly ludicrous situation where the current set of reforms hasn't even finished being implemented yet, and we were already thinking about the next set of reforms after that. So I think scaling back on some of that would probably be quite helpful, both for the sector to deliver education, but also for employers to be able to understand what it is that these qualifications actually mean, and for young people in schools to be able to understand what are my routes here, what are my options here. In terms of what's kind of holding the FE sector back or what you should do, one phrase that we hear a lot is, oh, it's all about parity of esteem. And if we just were able to get sort of middle-class parents to look at the FE sector as a legitimate option for their child, that would solve all of the problems. I think that's kind of been the push with things like degree apprenticeships to make those actually very high return qualifications more attractive to people whose children are sort of further up the ability distribution, for example. So people who are getting better grades at their GCSEs. And I think that's a way to go. And that is going to draw more people into the FE sector. And that's going to be probably quite beneficial in many cases for their long run earnings. What I don't think that does is address that question of what do you do with the bottom 15 to 35%? Because the problem is there are genuine differences in prior attainment and genuine differences, at least in academic ability, that go into these sectors. And you can't just wish that away. So putting on stuff to make the FE sector more attractive to people with high levels of ability and try and draw them in might well be a great thing to do on its own merit, but that's not the same policy as thinking about what you do to try and help and support people at the other end of the ability distribution who are in the FE sector because their only other option is dropping out and doing nothing at all.
There's some parallels across the different sectors here where if you are thinking about who you want to, which groups to target to try and promote opportunity, are you talking about helping the diamond in the rough go on to the very best institutions, the very best universities and meet their full potential? Are you talking about helping those in the bottom quarter of the ability distribution perhaps to push on and get those key central qualifications that enable them to quote unquote get on in life? It feels like I know clearly we'd like to do it all, but it feels like there's a need to choose. And I suppose if we think about growth as well, I mentioned that before in one of Keir Starmer's 5 missions. Education and skills feels like a relevant bit of that policy picture, or at least it should be. And you can imagine something similar. Are we thinking about improving the skills and qualifications of those people you're talking about, Christine, who maybe didn't get good GCSEs? Or are we thinking about helping spin-offs from the University of Cambridge grow to become world-beating AI firms or whatever? I mean, Jack, if you were, making the pitch for higher education and how it fits into the growth agenda, what are the things you'd be thinking about?
I think my focus, although I said earlier something about higher education not being the area that I would look at to kind of promote mobility, or the first place I'd go to reform to try to boost mobility, I think there are cases where you could look at the higher education sector and think that the money is not being used as effectively as it could be. And I think an example case here, and I'm going to take some flack for this, but I think an example case here is the creative arts, where tuition fees are £9,250, but average earnings are no better than they are for people who don't go to university. And we have around 3 times as many people doing creative arts as we have studying physics, for example. So we've got a large number of students, and they don't go on to earn very much. And as a result, even with the reforms to the student loan system, they cost the taxpayer a lot of money and actually don't benefit themselves from going to university either. So it seems to me that there is sort of money being spent in the system that could be kind of pulled out and placed elsewhere that would be potentially more beneficial for growth.
Okay, so if you're thinking about growth, you want to get the biggest bang for your buck, and you go beyond that short-term firefighting we were talking about earlier, maybe you would think big about the sorts of courses and fees, subject-specific fees, things like that. Is that what we're getting at?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly some subject areas where there is a lot of bang for your buck, but at the same time, there are also typically the courses that attract a lot of international students. So I wouldn't necessarily say that those are the places that the government should be sending money to from the kind of lower earning end of the university system. I would more say that that money could be kind of rerouted to somewhere else in the education system.
Okay, Christine, final quick-fire question. If you were sat in front of Jackie Smith or Bridget Phillipson, I suppose, and you were saying what area do you prioritise with a growth hat on, what are you thinking?
Well, if I'm sat in front of Jackie Smith and it has to be about skills policy, I'd say, again, this kind of group who have lower levels of qualification, who are struggling even to get the first step on the ladder.
Okay.
If I'm sat in front of Bridget Phillipson, who has a slightly wider remit, I'd be saying, look, a lot of these inequalities are happening much, much, much earlier in life. They're evident already by the age of 5, and they're pretty stubborn throughout the school system. So let's see what we can do upstream to have fewer fires to put out later on.
Okay, and that is a separate podcast. So I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the IFS Zooms In. If you'd like to see more of our work, you can visit www.ifs.org.uk. And to further support us, you could consider becoming a member for as little as £10 a month. You can find out more in the episode description. We'll see you next time.